Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're talking all about questions. We're talking about the power of asking questions and also how to ask the quote unquote right questions. So often, I've found that many of us, our automatic brains, tend to ask ourselves what I am calling the quote unquote wrong questions. And I see this coming up everywhere. And I do tend to avoid binaries like this. I tend to avoid quote unquote right and quote unquote wrong. But in this situation, I'm going to use it because I see so many of us getting stuck asking these quote unquote wrong questions, and they keep us spinning in indecision, feeling completely disempowered, completely overwhelmed, and just frozen. And we're unable to move forward because we get stuck in asking the wrong questions. Now, for context, when we think about this concept of right and wrong questions, you could also think about them through the lens of solution-focused questions versus problem-focused questions. Now, we're going to talk about this much more in depth today, but our automatic brains tend toward problem-focused questions first. So these are the questions that I am calling the quote-unquote wrong questions today, and they tend to look like a focus solely on the problem and its impact. Now, what I want to propose is that it is incredibly beneficial for our brains to start shifting into solution-focused questions whenever we're feeling stuck or frustrated or overwhelmed and we're lacking that sense of control. Whenever it seems like everything in the world is just happening around you and to you, and you are grasping for that sense of direction and control and certainty, this is when I think bringing in solution-focused questions, what I'm calling asking the quote-unquote right questions, becomes especially impactful. Now, like I mentioned, I don't usually like to use the binary of right and wrong because there is no such thing. This is truly a subjective concept. But when we think about times when we are feeling stuck and overwhelmed and frustrated and needing that sense of direction, I do think the best way to support yourself is to step away from the problem-focused question and start asking yourself solution-focused questions instead. And in that context, I do think the solution-focused question is the right type of question to ask. So with that in mind, I am still going to use the idea of asking the quote unquote right questions versus the quote unquote wrong questions today, even though it is kind of a dangerous label to use, because once we start shifting our approach to asking questions and we start thinking in the frame or through the lens of these quote unquote right questions, you're going to find that you can step out of that spin cycle of indecision and into action so much faster. Okay, so by the end of this episode, you are going to walk away with a very clear idea of what I mean by asking the right question, and also how you can start shifting your thinking to focus on that right question much more often. Okay, so we're going to talk about why asking the quote unquote right questions is so important in helping us move forward. Then we're going to explore examples of what asking the quote unquote wrong question looks like, and then how we might tweak that to make it a question that's really supportive for our brains, for our goals. And then finally, we're going to talk through some ways that you can apply this concept in your life and all of the questions that you're going to be asking yourself every day. Okay, so first, why does it matter that we ask this right question? So when we focus on asking the right questions, it makes a very powerful impact on our problem solving, on our clarity, and really our overall understanding of whatever it is we're navigating. And this is for several different reasons that I want to dive into in some nuance because I think it's important, okay? So when we ask the right questions, it really helps us, first of all, shift our focus. It helps us shift from kind of dwelling on problems into seeking solutions. So, for example, if I keep asking myself, "Ugh, why can't I just make dinner without so much resistance like so and so? And I compare myself, and why can't I just make dinner without all the drama, just like my sister or my friend or whatever? When I'm asking that type of question, I feel super stuck. I feel inadequate. I feel frustrated, and I certainly don't move forward, right? I'm just kind of beating myself up, finding all of my areas of lack. But when I make just the slightest shift to that question and I ask, hold on, how can I remove some of the friction between me and making dinner at 6 o'clock? When I make that shift, I start directing my energy in a much more useful direction, directing it toward finding actionable steps rather than just dwelling on the challenge that I see. Okay, so that's number one. It really helps us to shift our focus. Number two, when we ask the right questions, it helps provide a sense of control. So, when we craft the right questions, we also start empowering ourselves in our unique situation. It helps move us out of this kind of passive mindset of why is all of this stuff happening to me into a much more active mindset of what do I want to do about it. Okay, this sense of agency really puts us in the driver's seat, and it can be, frankly, much more empowering overall. And we'll talk about all of these much more in depth throughout the episode. Number three is that it really helps us clarify our goals and our objectives. So, for example, if I'm asking, what am I completing during this time today? That encourages me to articulate my priorities. And this clarity helps me to create a clear roadmap of action steps rather than spinning in overwhelm of the big picture, trying to do, quote unquote, all the things and then never getting anything done. But when you ask the right question of what am I completing during this specific time, that really gives your brain direction. The next reason is that asking the right questions can help us deconstruct problems. So when we're asking effective questions, it helps us break down what seems to be a big, complex problem into much more manageable parts. So rather than asking, oh, why am I so bad with time? We could start asking, what are the specific challenges I face with time right now? When we make that small shift, we have a much clearer obstacle to solve for. It allows us to much more easily identify and then address those areas that require a little bit more scaffolding and start building it. Additionally, the process of asking powerful, reflective questions helps us to foster greater self-awareness. Rather than asking, why am I always so overwhelmed? You might instead ask, how do I typically respond when I'm feeling overwhelmed? Are there certain patterns in my behavior? Again, it's just a slight shift from why am I always overwhelmed to how do I typically respond when I'm overwhelmed. That slight shift really encourages us to start exploring our own reactions, our own behaviors, which is crucial for helping us to make informed decisions and continue growing overall. Also, when we're asking the right questions, it really encourages learning and adaptation. So the right questions helps to foster a growth mindset, a mindset of continuous learning and adaptation. When we start asking questions like, what can I learn from this experience? We're probably going to start viewing our obstacles and our challenges as opportunities for growth much more often than why does this keep happening, right? And then finally, it helps to promote greater positive self-talk. So when we are asking the quote unquote right questions, when we are asking constructive questions, it can also contribute to our positive self-talk. So instead of reinforcing all the negative beliefs that come so easily to our brains, questions like, ugh, why am I always failing? We can reframe that internal dialogue with just a small shift. What am I celebrating today? What went well today? What did I learn today? This slight shift in language to the quote unquote right question can really promote a more resilient mindset that is open to learning and growing. So again, it's no secret that I love a good question. If you have been a podcast listener for a minute, you know I have questions all the time. And that's for good reason. When we start focusing on questions, the right questions, it not only helps us find practical answers, but it also contributes to a much clearer understanding of the situation. It fosters self awareness and it promotes a much more empowered mindset so that we can start taking actions in a way that works for us and our ADHD brains. Okay, so that's kind of the overarching reasons why I love questions so much, why I think they are so impactful. Now, you might be asking yourself, but Paula, how do I even know if I'm asking the right or the wrong question? How can I tell? Great question, dear listener. And it's important to mention, again, even though I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, categorizing a question as quote unquote right or quite quote unquote wrong is totally subjective. There is no right or wrong question. And it also really depends on the context of the specific goal or the circumstance or your expectations, which again, this is why I'm always a little hesitant to use this kind of binary. But again, I do think there's some general considerations that we can think about to help inform whether we're categorizing our questions as quote unquote wrong or right, which often lie in the framing and the mindset behind the question. So what I'm saying here is, what is the thought and the feeling behind that question you're asking? What is driving this question? What's the thought behind the question? What's the question behind the question? Okay. So let's start by talking about how we know whether we're asking the quote unquote wrong questions. So here are some key characteristics. First of all, there's often negative framing. Okay, so we often know we're asking the wrong question because it has some negative framing around it. It usually focuses on what's lacking or what can't be done or where we're falling short. For example, why am I always failing at this? Why am I terrible at goals? Why am I always late? These types of questions are not very productive because all they're really doing is emphasizing failure and our lack, and it can really lead to this feeling of stuck, feeling really kind of hopeless. The second area where we know it's probably not going to be a super supportive question is when it's coming from a place of blame or a place of comparison. When blame and comparison drive the questions, it can really tend to put us in a counterproductive space. For example, why can't I be as productive as my colleagues? That type of question can foster, again, a feeling of inadequacy rather than inspiring growth. Now, again, I'm sure some of you are listening and you're like, yeah, but what about this time? But this could be really helpful. There are always exceptions whenever we bring in binaries. I will talk about this toward the end. For example, if we actually pause and answer that question without judgment, we could learn something. Why am I not as productive as my colleagues? Let's actually answer that, right? We might be able to learn something. But again, most of us don't actually pause. Instead, we just stop with the question and use it as a form to beat ourselves up. All that self-judgment, that is not super helpful. And then the third indication that we're probably not asking a great question is that the question is unactionable. We can't do anything with it. Quote unquote wrong questions often don't give us any direction. They don't lead to a practical solution of any kind. Instead, we ask, why is this happening to me? Why do they always do that? That's probably not going to guide us toward any type of forward momentum. It doesn't allow us to really address the situation. Again, there are always exceptions. I'm sure we can argue this, but by and large, when we're relying on negative framing, when there is blame or comparison in the question, or when the question is super unactionable, these are probably not super effective questions to help you move forward and grow. These might be labeled as quote unquote the wrong question. So then on the flip side, let's talk about the right question. What are some characteristics here? Well, first of all, is positive framing. So the quote unquote right questions are usually framed positively. Usually they focus on what can be done and potential solutions. So for example, what steps can I take to improve this area? That type of question really directs our attention to space for growth, where we can improve. Questions that encourage empowerment, questions that empower rather than discourage, these are also considered quote unquote right questions most of the time. So instead of thinking to yourself, oh, why do I always mess this up? You might ask a more empowering question like, what can I learn from this situation so that I'm more informed next time? Another type of right question is a question that's actionable and solution oriented. They're ones that guide you toward practical steps you can take. For example, how can I approach this task differently for better results? How might I approach this in a new way to get a different experience? That type of question is going to encourage us to focus on problem solving and forward momentum. And that brings me to the next characteristic of the quote unquote right question, which is when we are future focused. So right questions often have a future oriented perspective. They are geared toward growth. Questions like, what can I do differently moving forward? This type of question really helps us learn from our experiences rather than staying stuck and dwelling on our past mistakes and using all of our past as evidence of why we can't do things in the future. And then finally, we have questions that are personalized. So right questions are often quite personalized to your unique situation. They take into account your strengths, your areas of growth, your unique situation and circumstance. For example, what strategies work best for me in managing my time when I have an unpredictable schedule? What's the best for my brain? What feels most supportive for me? Those types of questions really recognize that need for individualized solutions. Okay, so in short, we are asking the quote unquote wrong questions when we are asking ones that are negatively framed, when we're focused on blame or comparison, and they kind of lack any practicality. On the other side, we know we're asking the quote unquote right questions more often when they are positively framed, when they're empowering, when they're actionable and solution oriented, future focused, and personalized to your context. All right. So now let's talk about shifting from asking the quote unquote wrong questions into asking the quote unquote right questions. How can we do that? Because when we do, that's really going to help us grow. So what are some examples of this? So I'm going to give first the wrong question, and I'll share a little bit about why I have it under the wrong question label. And then I'll give an alternative of what might be the right version or the right alternative that will help you move forward. Okay, so we'll first look at the quote unquote wrong version and then how we might shift it into the right type of question. So the wrong type of question to ask might be, why can't I just stay organized like everybody else? It's not that hard. Why can't I just do this? Okay, this type of question focuses on our perceived lack. Not surprisingly, it leads to a whole lot of inadequacy. When I ask myself that, I just want to shut right down. But the right question, how we can shift that, is what strategies can I use to enhance my organizational skills? Where am I successful at organization, and how can I use that to inform these other areas? These types of questions really shift the focus to actionable steps where you can grow rather than staying and dwelling in those perceived weaknesses. Okay, so that's example one. I have 5 examples for you. Number 2, wrong question. Why am I so scattered? Why am I so unfocused? This type of question really emphasizes the perceived problem. It's very leading. It is not subjective whatsoever, but that's what our brains love to do. Why am I so unfocused? Why am I so scattered? Why am I so distracted all the time? Why can't I ever do blah, 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 right? Again, when I'm thinking those types of questions, I feel so stuck. I feel completely powerless. But when we shift it into the right question, we might ask ourselves, what supports can I put in place to reduce the distractions? What can I do to help me strengthen my focus as much as possible? By reframing that question, the emphasis, again, is on leveraging scaffolding. It's on finding ways to work with our ADHD brains rather than spinning in what's wrong. Question 3, the wrong way to ask it. Why do I always procrastinate on everything that's important? How many times have you asked yourself this? Or why do I always procrastinate on the things that are just for me? I can always do it for everyone else, but why do I always procrastinate on the things for me? This question has a lot of self-blame in it, right? We're blaming a lot, and it's not actually addressing the underlying factors that might be contributing to the procrastination. We're just blaming ourselves and staying stuck. So what can we do instead? The right way to approach this might be a question like, what's in the way of my getting started? Where's the friction here? What can I put in place to make this easier to get started? Any type of question like that is going to encourage greater introspection and problem solving, which allows you to really approach the procrastination situation and navigate it with much greater ease. All right, next example. Why can't I just be as productive as my colleagues? Why can't I just get as much done as everyone else? And this is filled with compare and despair, right? Total compare and despair energy. And it can easily create that sense of failure, that sense of inadequacy. So how do we shift it? Well, the right version might be, what productivity techniques work best for my brain? What approach or what method do I want to develop for myself to get those things done on time? When we can personalize the question, it again helps emphasize a focus on you and your growth rather than getting stuck in the compare and despair to everyone else. And as a side note, if you want support in designing your own toolkit, let's talk. This is literally what I do with my clients, both in my small group coaching program, We're Busy Being Awesome, and one-on-one. Okay, let's create your system that works for you. That is my jam. I would love to help you do it. Okay, last example. Wrong question. Why is it so hard for me to follow a routine? Why can't I just stick to my habit? Why is it so hard? Okay. Again, this question focuses a lot on the difficulty rather than exploring your strengths or strategies to make routines more manageable. Okay. So instead, you might ask yourself, what adjustments could I make to my routine to make it more ADHD friendly? How can I help myself remember the routine more easily? What feels like support for me? How could I bring in accountability if that helps me follow through? Again, this question acknowledges the need for adjustments and it focuses on the practical, personal solutions for creating a routine that works for you. And again, as a side note, I have a free course called the ADHD Routine Revamp. I don't think I've ever mentioned this on the podcast here, but the training is awesome. It's a 3-part video. You can watch it all in about 30 minutes or so faster if you're a 1.5 speed watcher like me. But there's a step-by-step workbook that goes right with it, and it'll help you clarify and lock in your routine so you can make it stick. If you want to check this out, head to I'mBusyBeingAwesome.com/routine, and you can take the course right away. I'mBusyBeingAwesome.com/routine. You can also tap through the link in the show notes to get started. I'm releasing this episode, I think it's toward middle or end of December. So you could even get started on the New Year's routines and habits that you may want to establish. Get a head start and watch that training. All right. Now, the last thing I want to mention before we dive into action steps to help you start practicing all of this that we've talked about today and to start asking the right questions is it's so important to actually answer the questions your brain asks. Now, I alluded to this a little bit before, but the only way we can actually grow from questions, whether they're the right or the wrong questions, is if we actually pause and answer them. Now, your brain will not want to do this. It will resist. It will tell you, I don't know. It will tell you, this is too hard. I'm confused. I don't know where to start. This is all perfectly normal. This is not a problem. But also, do not believe your brain. Okay? This is just what your brain will absolutely think. So when it thinks it, go, yeah, right on time. I knew this was going to happen. And then we're going to pause. And we're going to ask ourselves, okay, but what if I did know? What might I answer if I did know the answer? Or let's just take a guess. What might the answer be? What might we guess here, brain? What could it be? Or if I didn't have to act on this answer, right? If this is just me answering the question, I don't have to tell anybody. I'm only answering for myself to figure out the answer, brain. What would that answer be? Or if there is no right or wrong answer, there's just an answer. What might my answer be for now? And then give your brain the space, give your brain the wiggle room and the freedom to play around and explore and find an answer without judgment. I'm telling you, even if you completely ignore literally everything that we talk about today in regard to finding your quote unquote right or wrong questions, if you just focus on answering every question your brain asks, I promise you're going to have so much more clarity and direction overall because it pulls you out of the spin instantly. When your brain keeps spinning on, but what if they don't like what I wrote in the email? What will they think? What will they think about this? What will they say about that? If you allow your brain to keep spinning and ruminating over and over and over, you're going to stay stuck. But if you pause and you literally answer those questions, you stop the spin. And when you stop the spin, you give yourself a chance to create traction and move forward. Okay, what if they don't like the email? Answer that. What will you do? How will you handle it? Now, you can't know for sure what they might think, but what are you afraid they might think? And then, okay, let's say they think that. Then what? What are you going to do? What if they think that? Answer that question. Be the boss of your brain. Okay, every time your brain asks a question, give it an answer and move forward. Eventually, as you keep releasing all the quote unquote wrong questions and focusing on the quote unquote right questions, you will be astonished at the gains that you make and how quickly you make them. Okay, so that's the last little point I want to make before we get into our step-by-step is if you don't do anything else we've talked about today, just start answering those questions your brain asks. Pause and answer. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of asking questions and the difference between asking yourself the quote unquote wrong questions versus the right questions. We've looked at common characteristics of each type of question and examples for each of them. Now let's talk strategy. How can we start small and implement part of the practice this week? By the way, that right there is a right kind of question. How do we start small and implement part of the practice this week? What I'm going to do is offer you a step-by-step process because that's my jam. And this is a reminder to start where you are. Okay, so we're going to have 3 different stages in this practice. Notice the one that feels most accessible for you and start there. Sound good? Okay, so step 1 is to increase your self-awareness around the questions, okay? As always, increasing your awareness is the number 1 place to start in anything. If we don't have awareness of what's happening, we won't have the ability to pause in the moment and implement the next steps, okay? So first things first, begin by paying attention to your internal dialogue. Notice the questions that you habitually ask yourself. Notice the ones that keep looping over and over. And more specifically, notice the ones that make you feel tight or restricted or spinny or overwhelmed or frustrated or inadequate or ashamed, right? In other words, if the question makes you shut down or feel bad, it's probably not a quote unquote right question. Unless it's the discomfort of growth, but that usually feels quite different, okay? So by starting to notice those questions and identifying the ones that make you shut down versus the ones that allow you to move forward, you're taking that first important step in taking action, okay? Then we get to part 2. This is where we're going to start clearly identifying the specific questions that we might label as quote unquote wrong questions. So you're going to list out the questions that you often find yourself asking that are negatively framed or involve blame or shame or are unactionable. You just kind of spin in them. Because when you intentionally recognize these patterns of questions, it again helps you further increase your awareness and awareness of the specific questions. And it helps you start noticing them that much quicker so that you can start reframing them into a much more supportive inquiry, a much more supportive question that will help you move forward. So, for example, one of my brain's most favorite quote unquote wrong questions to ask recently is, how is it already 6 o'clock or whatever the time is that it is already? It doesn't matter what time it is. How is it already blank o'clock? Where the heck did the time go? Why do I never have enough time? Those are the wrong questions my brain loves to ask. None of these are good questions. None of them are supportive or empowering. They just leave me in total inaction and frustration. Okay. So you might notice, what are your questions that your brain loves to ask that just don't feel good and they keep you stuck? Okay. Start identifying those. And then that brings us to part 3, which is to reframe these wrong questions and start focusing on the right questions instead. How do we reframe these questions? So start taking those wrong questions you've noticed yourself asking and start reframing them into a more constructive, forward-moving approach. So for example, if you're asking yourself, oh, why do I always fail at this? Or why do I never follow through? Maybe you shift that into, what can I learn from this past experience so that I can do better next time? Or with my brain's favorite question, how is it already 6 o'clock? I might instead ask, how could I do a better job of noticing the passage of time throughout the afternoon? What could I do to help make that more visible so that my mind has awareness that the time is passing? Because when we can start reframing these questions, it's helping us shift our mindset and it's opening the door to much more proactive solutions. My brain goes, oh, I could probably start setting timers for every hour or every 45 minutes from lunch o'clock on so that I have an idea of when that time is passing. That could be super helpful, right? And that approach, not surprisingly, feels so much better overall because we have more direction. We're not stuck in inaction with no solutions. Now, 3 ways that you can really help yourself focus on asking the quote unquote right questions include, number 1, setting a positive or clear intention beforehand. Okay. So before you tackle a task or a project or you sit down to work, set an intention by asking yourself, what positive outcome am I going to achieve? Or what am I focused on creating during this session? Or what am I going to learn as I sit down and read this? Or how am I showing up today? How do I want to show up? Who do I want to be in this next hour? Setting that clear intention for your brain focuses your energy on success, on forward momentum, on what you want, rather than dwelling on all of the potential obstacles that might come up. Okay, so focus on the intention you want to create. Number 2, use future-focused language. Okay, so when you reflect on a past mistake, try phrasing your question in a future-oriented way instead of, why did I mess this up again? Instead, focus on, what steps could I take to avoid this happening again? What can I learn from this? Again, this approach, this small shift, encourages a growth mindset. It emphasizes learning over spinning in the past and all those perceived failures or all the reason your brain thinks you can't do it. And then finally, we want to seek solutions instead of blame. So when we're faced with a challenge, we want to ask questions that lead to solutions rather than blaming ourselves or blaming other people. Okay, so for instance, why is this happening to me again? Or why does this keep happening? Right? How can we replace that with something like, what steps can I take to address this? What steps can I take to move through this so that it doesn't keep happening? Now, hear me. I'm not saying that we're blaming ourselves, right? We are not blaming at all. We're not blaming other people. We're not blaming ourselves. There's no blame here. Instead, if you're feeling stuck and you want to move forward, we want to shift from blame into solution. We want to shift into action. This is what's happening. Here's what I want to do about it. This shift is so powerful because it promotes a much clearer problem-solving mentality. And again, that's so much more empowering in helping us move forward, which is what we want. We want to ask thoughtful, intentional questions that allow us to learn and grow so that we can make adjustments and do better and keep finding the most supportive ways to work with our brain to reach those goals and follow through on those projects and focus on what matters most to us. All right, my friends, that's going to do it for us this week. And if you're ready to take the concepts you learned on this podcast and apply them to your life, If you're ready to learn how to support your ADHD in a way that works for you within a small, supportive community in We're Busy Being Awesome, I would love for you to check out today's show notes or head to I'mBusyBeingAwesome.com/group to learn more about how we can make that happen. Also, if you want to learn my simple step-by-step approach to lock in your routine and make it stick, check out my free course, the ADHD Routine Revamp. You can tap through the link in the show notes or head to I'mBusyBeingAwesome.com/routine to sign up. Until next time, keep being awesome. I'll talk with you soon.